The sun had long since set over Hollow Glen, a small town that had once been full of laughter and life. Now, since the streets were silent except for a low, shuffling murmurs that echo off cracked storefronts and empty bones. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of wilted flowers from a long forgotten garden. Eli moved slowly through the town square, his footsteps dragging slightly, leaving a faint trail of dirt behind him. The world around him felt strange, muted, distant, as if wrapped in thick fog. He had awoken 3 days ago in the remnants of what looked like a hospital room, his memory fractured and his body aching with a cold that sank deep into his bones. Since then, he had wandered aimlessly, trying to piece together what had happened. What unsettled him most, though, were the others. They were everywhere, figures with pale, ashen skin and hollow eyes. They shuffled through the streets, groaned softly, and sometimes reached out with trembling hands. Eli had expected them to attack, to snarl or bite, like the monsters from the old movies. He remembered, but they didn't. When they saw him, they paused. Their cloudy eyes followed him, their heads tilting slightly, as if in recognition or confusion. Then, slowly, they would move aside, giving him room to pass. At first, Eli had been too terrified to move, but as the hours turned to days, he began to realize something unsettling. They weren't hostile at all. Some even seemed to smile. A faint twitch of cracked lips as he walked by. One had tried to hand him a broken locket, placing it gently in his palm before continuing on its way. Tonight, as the wind swept through the empty square, Eli stopped in front of the fountain. The water had long dried up, and moss grew thick along its rim. He caught his reflection in the cracked marble. Pale skin, darkened veins beneath his eyes, lips with no warmth in them. He reached up, touched his cheek, and felt how cold it was. A flicker of movement caught in his eye. Across the square, a group of others gathered beneath a street lamp that sputtered weakly against the darkness. They were watching him, silent and still. A small girl among them, no more than 10, by her size, raised a hand and waved. Eli hesitated, then slowly waved back. The group began to shuffle closer, surrounding him in a loose circle. None of them spoke, but he could feel something passing between them. A kind of understanding, a recognition deeper than words. One of them, a tall man in tattered clothes, reached out and gently touched Eli's shoulder. His hand was cold, but not hostile. It was almost comforting. For the first time since he had woken, Eli didn't feel afraid. He looked around at their faces, some decayed, some barely holding on to fragments of who they once were. And a terrible realization began to creep through his mind. The air around him seemed to hum, the silence pressing down as the truth whispered at the edges of his thoughts. The reason they did not attack him, the reason they looked at him with familiarity, the reason the air tasted like ash when he breathed. He turned his eyes once more to the cracked fountain, to the pale figure reflected there, eyes sunken, skin grey, lips the colour of dust, and he understood. He was one of them. The night deepened as a pale moon rose above the rooftops of Hollow Glen, casting a silvery glow over the ruined town. Eli remained by the fountain, surrounded by the quiet gathering of the dead. They stood motionless now. Their attention was fixed on just him, as if waiting for something. They were all waiting. Some signal or word that he didn't know how to give. He felt their presence like a whisper at the edge of thought, a strange empathy that pressed against his mind. They were not mindless. Beneath the hollow stairs, there was sorrow, a deep, aching grief that rippled through them all. It felt ancient, heavy, as if it had been there for a long time before the world had fallen apart. The little girl who had waved to him earlier shuffled closer. Her hair hung in a brittle strands, and her eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. In her small hands she clutched a wilted daisy. She extended it toward him. Eli hesitated, but took it. The stem broke his cold finger, and for a moment, something flickered across his memory. Bright sunlight, laughter, a woman's face, her voice, calling his name. Then it was gone, leaving only the silence. He wanted to ask them who they were, what had happened, but his voice felt trapped somewhere in his chest, deep in his chest. When he tried to speak, only a dry rasp escaped his throat. The others tilted their heads slightly at the sound, then began to move again. Slowly, deliberately, turning toward the old church that stood at the far end of the square. The tall man gestured for Eli to follow. Eli had the only option but to obey. Eli obeyed. They moved as a group, a procession of the forgotten. Their shuffling footprints echoing softly against the cracked cobblestone. The world felt different in their presence. The air was still, almost reverent, as if the night itself were holding its breath. When they reached the church, the doors were already open. Candles burned inside, flickering weakly in the drafts that whispered through shattered stained glass. The scent of melted wax and damp earth filled the air. Inside, pews had been pushed aside, and in the centre of the nave lay a figure covered with tattered sheet. The tall man knelt beside it, bowing his head. The others followed suit, forming a silent circle around the body. Eli stood uncertainly at the edge, unsure what he was witnessing. Then one by one, they began to hum, a low, mournful sound that resonated through the hollow church. It wasn't a song of the living, it was something older, a lament that spoke of its loss, of its memory, of all of the endings that refused to end. The sound crept into Eli's bones, stirring something within him that he didn't understand. As the song swelled, he felt the pull of a memory again, a flash of light, and then a scream, the crash of glass. A face, pale and frightened. His face, pale and frightened. His own hands, red, trembling And then, darkness. He gasped and staggered back. The others stopped their song, their eyes turning toward him. The tall man rose and reached out again, his cold fingers brushing Eli's arm. The gesture was neither threatening nor comforting this time. It was a reminder, a connection. A connection Eli would remember. Eli looked down at the sheet-covered body, and the truth struck him like a blade. He knew that face beneath the fabric. He had seen it in mirrors, in photographs, in fleeting glimpses of who he had once been. The dead were mourning him. The candles burned low, their light trembling against the church walls like dying stars. Eli stood frozen as the realization spread through him, hollow and cold. The body beneath the sheet, the one they had gathered around, the one they mourned, was his. His body was lying there, lifeless, and he remembers. He wanted to deny it, to tear the sheet away and prove himself wrong. But some instinct deep inside whispered that the truth had already taken root. He knew the weight of that silence, the shape of that stillness. His body, his former body, lay there, unmoving, while he stood apart from it. The tall man who had led him there slowly turned, his eyes heavy with something that resembled pity. He stepped closer and placed a hand over Eli's chest, right where his heart should have been beating. Nothing, no rhythm, no warmth, just the faint vibration of the dead whirled around them. Eli staggered backward, breath catching, or trying to. He realized then that he hadn't truly breathed since he'd awoken. The act of inhaling was just a habit, an echo of what he'd once done to survive. But there was no air filling his lungs, no pulse thrumming beneath his skin. The others began to move again, forming a slow procession around the body. Their voices rose in another low hum, softer now, more distant. It felt like the morning, and more like release. Eli felt the vibrations in the air tremble through him, resonating with the emptiness inside his chest. He stepped forward once more, drawn by something he couldn't name. His fingers trembled as he reached towards the shrouded form. The sheet felt cool, the fabric brittle with time. He lifted it. Beneath was a pale, sunken face. His own. The lips were grey and slightly parted. The eyes, his eyes, were clouded over, staring at nothing. His hair clung to his forehead, matted with dried blood. The sight should have horrified him, but it didn't. Instead, a calm, weary sadness filled him, as though he had simply found something he had been missing for far too long. The little girl approached again, her tiny footsteps almost soundless. She held out the daisy, the same one she had given him earlier, though it now seemed fresh and whole. The petals bright and alive. She placed it gently on the chest of the corpse and then looked up at him. The hum quieted, and in that stillness, Eli felt something stir in the air, like a sigh carried by unseen wind. The others began to drift away, one by one, vanishing into the dark corners of the church. Soon only he and the girl remained. She stared at him for a moment longer, her gaze calm but knowing. Then she turned and walked toward the open doorway, disappearing into the pale light outside. Eli lingered beside his body. The candlelight flickered over his dead face, casting shadows that danced across the stone floor. He thought about the days since he'd awoken. The silence, the cold, the way the others had looked at him with something like kindness. He wasn't their prey. He was their kin. When he finally left the church, dawn was breaking. The world outside was bathed in ghostly glow, neither warm nor cold, but timeless. The others were gone, leaving only the faint impression of their footprints in the dirt. Eli looked towards the horizon and began to walk. He didn't know where he was going or why, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was full of memory, of sorrow, and of unspoken understanding. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled once, and then went quiet. He didn't flinch. He simply kept moving, one slow step at a time, into a world that no longer belonged to the living. Days passed, though time had lost its meaning. The sky stayed the same pale grey. No matter how far Eli walked, the air never warmed, never cooled. Even the wind carried no scent of life, only dust and echoes of things long gone. He wandered beyond the ruins of Hollow Glen, through empty fields, where the grass grew brittle and colourless. Occasionally, he would see others like him, figures moving in the distance, slow and aimless, always watching but never approaching. There was no fear among them, no hunger, only the quiet recognition that they all shared the same strange fate. But something began to change when Eli reached the edge of the forest. There, at the border where the cracked asphalt road met the tangled roots of ancient trees, he heard a sound that did not belong to this world. It was faint at first, a soft rhythm carried by the wind. Then, unmistakably, a voice, not the hollow groans of the dead, not the low humming of his kin, a living voice. He froze, every sense sharpened. The forest loomed dark before him, branches swaying like skeletal arms. Beneath their canopy, the sound grew clearer. Footsteps, hurried, human, and then laughter, real laughter, raw and bright, like something from another lifetime. He stepped closer, drawn by instinct. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of them. A small group huddled near a campfire. The flames licked the air greedily, casting warm light over their faces. Their skin was flushed with heat and colour. Their movements were alive. They passed around a tiny tin pot, steam curling upward. The smell of smoke and food filled the air. It hit Eli like a memory made flesh. He watched them from the shadows, unable to move closer. The warmth of the fire seemed to push against him. A his body no longer understood. His fingers twitched, reaching for it, but the light stung his skin. Not pain, exactly. More like rejection, like the will of the living itself was turning him away. One of the people by the fire turned suddenly, glancing into the trees. It was a woman with sharp eyes and a scar along her cheek. Her gaze locked onto his shape in the dark. "Who's there?" she called out. Eli froze. Her words were sharp, cutting through the silence. The others turned, grabbing makeshift weapons. Pipes, knives, and a rusted rifle. He tried to step back quietly, but a branch cracked under his foot. They heard. Flashlights flicked on, beams cutting through the dark. They landed on him. His pale face, his sunken eyes, his torn clothes. The living recoiled instantly, their faces twisting in fear and disgust. "Zombie," one of them shouted. The group surged forward, weapons raised. Eli lifted his hands, trying to speak, to say no, to tell them he wasn't like the others. But only a low, broken sound escaped his throat, a groan like every other corpse that had ever stumbled from the dark. The rifle went off. The sound split the air. Eli fell to his knees, though not from pain. The bullet, on the other hand, tore through him, but there was no blood, no agony, just a dull impact of something that didn't matter anymore. The living hesitated, unsure, watching as he struggled to his feet again. He didn't approach, didn't attack. He only stared at them with eyes that once held life. The woman with the scar lowered her gun slightly, confusion flickering in her expression. "It's not," she began, but the others shouted over her, "Finish it." The shot came again, and this time Eli turned and fled into the trees. The forest swallowed him whole. He ran until the firelight was gone, until the living voices faded into the distance. When he finally stopped, the world was silent again. His breath, if it could be called that, came in slow, empty gasps. He looked down at his chest. sank to the ground and sat there for a long time, staring into the endless dark between the trees. The living feared him. The dead welcomed him. And in the hollow space between, Eli finally understood what he had become. Not a man, not a monster, but something trapped in the quiet space where life just refused to end. Eli lingered in the forest for what felt like days. Time slipped away like the mist between his fingers, impossible to hold and impossible to measure. The trees whispered softly above him, their branches bending like curious watchers. In their slow, creaking song, he thought he could almost hear words, faint echoes of things that had once been spoken by the living. He no longer felt hunger, nor thirst. The ache of his body was constant, but distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Every step he took made the world feel thinner, stretched between two realities. The warmth he could no longer touch, and the cold that would not let him rest. The wound from the bullet had begun to close, not in the way of healing, but in the way of time forgetting. The flesh drew together, grey and stiff, leaving only the faintest mark. He realized then that death did not rot him further. It preserved him in the shape of his final moments, forever incomplete. As he wandered deeper into the forest, he found signs of the living. Footprints, a torn scrap of cloth, a broken lantern. Each one stirred something in him, a faint pulse of that memory that hurt more than waves, sounds, and wounds. He could feel their warmth, even from a distance, like sunlight through glass. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and Eli stepped into a clearing where a stagnant pond reflected the pale sky. The surface was still and black. A mirror of the dead whirled above it. He approached slowly, drawn to the reflection, to what waited beneath. When he looked down, he expected to see the same hollow face from the church, the one he had already accepted as his own. But what stared back at him was different. His reflection was alive. It was his face, as it once had been. His eyes were bright, his cheeks full of colour, and breath fogging in the cold morning air. The living Eli blinked up from the water, confused. He mouthed something, words Eli couldn't even hear, though he knew exactly what they were. Why are you still here? The reflection's lips moved again, faster now. Eyes were wide in terror. The water began to ripple, distorting the image, until it broke apart into fragments. Eli fell to his knees beside the pond, reaching toward it, desperate to hold on to that fleeting glimpse of life. His fingers touched the surface, and the water turned black. It swallowed the reflection whole, devouring the image of warmth and colour. The surface boiled with shadows, faces pressing against it from below. Dozens of them. There were men, there were women, and there were children, all with the same hollow eyes. Their mouths opened in silent screams, bubbles rising from their lips like lost words. Eli stumbled backward, but the sound, no. The feeling filled his mind. 1,000 memories bleeding into one. Laughter, pain, pleading, fear. And beneath it all, one truth whispered again and again. You did this. He didn't understand. Couldn't. But the faces beneath the surface were relentless. Each one a fragment of the world he could no longer remember. And then, among them, he saw her, the woman from his memory, the one who had screamed before everything went dark. Her eyes met his through the murk off the pond. They were not angry. They were sad. Eli had reached out, once more. His hands were trembling as it hovered over the water. The ripples slowed. The reflection steadied. She mouthed a single word. Come. Then the water went still. Eli stood there in silence, the forest holding its breath around him. The air felt heavier now, as though the world itself had turned its gaze upon him. He looked once more into the black surface and saw nothing. No reflection, no light, no life, just darkness, waiting. And for the first time since his awakening, Eli took a step towards it. Eli stepped into the pond. The water was colder than anything he had ever felt. Colder than death itself. But it did not resist him. It accepted him, pulling him down gently, like a mother guiding a child to rest. As he sank, the faces beneath the surface rose to meet him. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, not with anger, but with understanding. The woman's hand reached out, her touch warm at last, and for a brief, fragile moment, he felt alive again. The world around him shivered, the darkness softening into light, and the ruined town, the empty church, the endless forest, they all began to fade, dissolving into quiet peace. The voices of the dead became a single soothing hum that filled the void where his heartbeat used to be. When the light finally faded, there was only still water in the pond. Calm, undisturbed, reflecting the pale morning sky. The wind passed gently through the trees, carrying a single daisy across the surface before letting it drift away. And Hollow Glen was silent once